We'll wait a few minutes till your mother gets here. Of course, that's what it always is.
Yeah, probably so. Well, you guys will have to speak up and ask lots of questions, that's all.
Mother's here.
Oh, okay. All right.
I feel like we should start on time, those of you that are here. There's 3 of you here.
I'm not going
Good evening.
finally had Iris. I was
Hello. Good evening.
Warren.
I'm Todd.
Taking all responsibility.
You're welcome, Warren.
Hey.
It does kind of
Thanks.
Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to stand close to this microphone. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Todd Morton. Some of you may know him. He co-teaches a class over there with that young lady in the back there, his mother. And Todd is a local clinical psychologist, also in South Carolina. And he went to school at UNC Chapel Hill, and we're just tickled that he's here to share with us depression, understanding depression, what it is and what to do about it. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your watch care. Please bring those continue to bring those safely here that wish to be here this evening. Help us to know and understand your will on this very important topic. Amen. Thank you, Todd.
All right. Thank you. All right. Let's see. So the goal for tonight is to give you some practical kind of understanding of depression and know a little bit about what causes it, what you can do about it, either for yourself or somebody else that you might know. Can you hear me all right? How's the speaker doing? Do what?
What guarantees?
What guarantees? 100% guaranteed. 100%. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't cure your depression, you get your money back. Okay? All right. There you go. All right. So feel free to ask questions as we go through. It can be a discussion. You know, if you ask too many questions, I might put you off till the end. But it goes better. It's more informative if you ask questions, and we'll kind of make sure that you're getting the information that you need. Okay, so what is depression? Depression is, it's going to take a little bit to kind of describe it, but depression is a set of symptoms, okay, that they tend to cluster together. So you'll see I've got a long list of symptoms of depression. People who get depressed don't have all the symptoms, but they'll have some of them, and they tend to go together in people. The symptoms are persistent, so it's more than being sad or down for a day or for a week. They're persistent, and they interfere with your everyday life, okay? And that's the key part of it. People ask, well, do I have depression or not? If you're sad, if you're down, if you have low energy, and it's interfering with your life, then you probably have something that we could call depression. Now, what you're going to do about it, that's another issue that we'll look at. Okay. So the symptoms of depression. So this is the list of symptoms. If I'm going to try to give somebody an official diagnosis of depression, this is kind of the symptoms that we look at for a diagnosis of a major depressive episode. So there's a list of 9 symptoms, and if you have 5 of those, and it's interfering with your life, then you're having a major depressive episode. If it's been going on for 2 weeks, that's the criteria that's set. Obviously, that's arbitrary. It's like 13 days, no, you're not depressed. 15 days, major depression. So let's go through some of these. Depressed mood, feeling sad or hopeless or being tearful, crying most of the day, every day. Okay. Next one, loss of interest in pleasurable activities. So people with depression tend to lose interest in things they used to enjoy. Hobbies they used to enjoy, activities they used to enjoy. A lot of times that means they tend to withdraw socially. Okay, so whereas they used to enjoy getting together with people, now they just want to keep to themselves. They don't want to be around people. A decrease or an increase in appetite most of the day, every day. Okay, so depression has different aspects to it. Part of it's the emotional part that we're familiar with, being sad and crying. Part of it is physical impairments, so things like appetite, okay? And people vary. Some people, when they get depressed, quit eating. They have no appetite, they don't want to eat, things don't taste good, and so they don't eat. Other people, when they get depressed, eat a bunch, okay? And so they're emotional eating. They eat comfort foods. Usually they don't choose to eat broccoli. They usually go for chocolate. Or other junk foods. But it can be either too much or too little, okay? And you'll see that's with several of the symptoms, that's the case. Sleep problems, okay? People who are depressed typically have problems with their sleep, and that can be either sleeping too much or not being able to sleep, okay? So it's a change in your sleep patterns. Very common for people with depression to have difficulty going to sleep, to wake up frequently during the night. Other people will sleep 18 hours a day. Okay, but disturbances, changes in your sleep patterns. Feeling tired most of the day, every day. Feeling worthless or inappropriate guilt most of the day, every day. So feeling guilty, feeling bad about yourself, feeling bad about things you've done. Increased or decreased activity most of the days. Usually it's decreased activity, but sometimes people become, when they're depressed, become restless and fidgety, particularly in children and adolescents. You'll see sometimes an increase in activity. Difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. Okay, so you just can't focus. Just a lack of motivation. You can't focus, can't stay on one thing, can't follow through on anything. And thoughts of death or suicide. Okay. So, if you've had 5 out of these 9 symptoms at any point for 2 weeks, at any point in your life, then you may have had depression, or you met the criteria for depression. Okay. Keep that in mind when you read about how many people have depression, when they talk about incidence of depression and how high it is. That's true. It doesn't mean that all those people, if you see 20% of people have depression, It doesn't mean that all of those people have ongoing depression for years. It means they've had episodes of depression, potentially diagnosable depression. So the course of depression varies a lot. Some people have an episode or 2 episodes of depression and it never comes back. Some people have chronic depression that stays with them all of their lives. So it's quite variable. Okay. It's unpredictable. It can go away, it can come back.
Is it genetic?
Okay. That's what we're getting to next. We're gonna talk about what causes depression, okay? But I'm gonna sidetrack for just a minute before we figure out what causes depression, okay? That's a major depressive episode. There are other kinds of, if you look in the psychiatrist's manual, there's all kinds of depression. So a psychiatrist, if you don't meet all these criteria, then you can have a different chronic depressive disorder, or there are a variety of different kinds of depressive disorders.
So in summary, having 1 or 2 of those periodically is no big deal.
Having 1 or 2 of those, well, I wouldn't say that it's no big deal. It can be a big deal, but it's not depression.
It's not clinical depression.
It's not clinical depression. Well, I should say it's not major depression. Like I said, there are other categories. They have depressive disorder not otherwise specified. They have premenstrual depressive disorder. They have all kinds of different things. So if you feel depressed and sad all day, every day, and that goes on for weeks or months, even though you don't have those other symptoms, we can find something to diagnose you with. Okay. And if it's one symptom that's so persistent that it's causing you problems in your life, then whether you meet the criteria or not, you need help. Okay. You need help from friends, family, a doctor. So one thing to know about these systems of diagnosis is these are arbitrary set of symptoms, and we set criteria that make it reasonable. 2 weeks, 5 out of 9 of these. Does that mean that somebody has 4 out of 9 of these doesn't have it, but somebody who has 6 out of 9 does? That's a little bit arbitrary. Okay. Depression is real, but it's diagnosing mental health difficulties, and particularly depression that we're talking about tonight, is not as clear-cut as diagnosing physical disease, okay? If I want to know whether you have COVID, I can look at the symptoms and say, hey, they probably got COVID or not, but then I can do a blood test and I can tell you, okay? Or if I want to know if you have the flu, or if I want to know if you have cancer, you do or you don't. That's not really the way diagnosis of depression works. So we're going to skip to a different disorder here. We're going to call it major digestive disorder, okay? So this is a disorder that I'm just making up for you right now. But the criteria are if you have 4 out of 6 of these symptoms, you have major digestive disorder. So we've got nausea, we've got either loss of appetite or increase in appetite, we've got vomiting, we've got stomach pain, diarrhea or constipation, and we've got gas. So if I have 4 out of those 6 symptoms, what's my problem? The 6 burritos that I had at Taco Bell. Okay. What else could it be? Could be the flu. Could be a stomach bug. Could be food poisoning. I might be pregnant. It's 2023. I might be pregnant. Okay. So these are symptoms that tend to go together. And so when you have those set of symptoms, you have a problem. But you asked you kind of brought up, is it genetic? What's the cause of this? It could be stomach ulcers, okay? Depression is like this major digestive disorder in that it's a set of symptoms that cluster together, but that doesn't mean that it's one disorder. It doesn't mean that all depression has the same cause, okay? There are a lot of different things that can cause major digestive disorder. There are a lot of different things that can cause depression. Okay, so it doesn't really make sense to talk about one cause of depression. One of the causes of depression is probably genetics. So we'll go in here. Let's see what we got here. Okay. So we'll look at genetics. Depression does tend to run in families, even when they control for, look at adoption studies and those kinds of things. So if your family members had problems with depression, then you're at higher risk for depression. Okay. It's certainly not 100%. Lots of people who have no depression in their family will end up getting depressed, and vice versa. But there is a connection for sure. Other physical illnesses can cause the symptoms of depression. So if you are having these problems, one thing you should do is go to your doctor and have them do tests. Thyroid problems, if you have an underactive thyroid, it'll mimic the symptoms of depression very strongly. No energy, changes in your emotion, changes in your sleep, changes in your appetite. So that's one that you can test and kind of rule out. And if it's your thyroid, they can give you medication to treat that. But it's also associated with other physical health problems. If you have chronic pain, if you have cancer, if you have heart problems, any kind of physical illness puts you at increased risk for depression. Okay? We don't necessarily know exactly why. Part of it is anything that limits your activities, that lowers your energy level, puts you at risk for these other symptoms as well. Let's see. Negative life events. Bad things happening to you put you at risk for depression. Okay, so that starts in childhood, childhoods where there are abuse or other problems in childhood. In adulthood, financial problems, big risk factor for depression. Relationship problems, divorces, big risk factors for depression. Pretty much anything that you can think of in your life. Physical illness is one of those. If you have illnesses that interfere with your ability to function, to get around and to do what you normally do, that puts you at risk for depression. Okay. Brain chemistry. Let's see. How many of you have heard that depression is a chemical imbalance? Okay. All right. I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Not disagreeing. Going back a number of years ago, there was a reason why the mental health field started calling it a chemical imbalance. Okay, one, partly because there's brain chemistry has to do with it, but more than that, because they found that people are willing to go get treatment for a medical illness. They're reluctant to go get treatment for a mental illness. And particularly when they started this campaign back in probably the late 80s, early 90s, people did not want to go to get treated for depression because it's a mental illness. And there's a lot of stigma that goes with that. It's a sign of weakness, or you're crazy, all that kind of stuff. So when they call it a chemical imbalance, then people are willing to go to their doctor and get, just like they'd be willing to go get tested to see if their thyroid has a problem, they'd be willing to go see if they have depression. And in fact, that campaign's been very successful. People are a lot more willing to seek treatment now than they used to be. When they talk about brain chemistry, they're usually talking about neurotransmitters in the brains. I don't want to go through a big anatomy lesson, but basically the neurons in your brain communicate with each other via chemicals called neurotransmitters. That's how they send messages back and forth to each other. And those neurotransmitters are concentrated at different areas of your brain. And so if you have a problem with a neurotransmitter, then whatever function is taking place in that part of your brain is not going to work well. Okay, so one of the ones they came up with, serotonin, is the one you'll see most referenced. It's concentrated in the areas of your brain that control emotions. So that makes sense. It's also concentrated in areas of your brain that control your appetite. So that makes sense. Whereas you wouldn't necessarily think emotions and appetite are connected, they have the same neurotransmitter working in them, so there's a connection there. The medication that is most commonly prescribed has its effect by increasing serotonin levels in your brain. Okay. Let's see. Measuring brain chemistry as a part of, as sort of figuring out what causes depression is an inexact science. You can't take a serotonin blood level. That doesn't tell you anything. You have to have an active scan of brain activity, not even a CAT scan or an MRI. You have to have a brain, like a PET scan, that shows where the activity is in your brain. So it's very difficult and very expensive, which means it's a little bit difficult to do research. You know, you can't do it on a bunch of people. You have just small groups. But they have found that that changes in brain chemistry, changes in serotonin levels, can result in decreased symptoms of depression. Then the last one I'm going to mention is negative thought patterns. Okay, people who are depressed tend to have negative thought patterns. They tend to have a lot of inaccurate thinking, and so they tend to, when something happens, particularly that's negative, they exaggerate it. Psychologists call it catastrophizing. So something bad happens, and it's not good. You know, your boss chewed you out at work. That's not good. But people who are depressed will tend to go with that and say, I'm going to get fired. Okay? And he's going to let me go, and then how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to pay the mortgage? How am I going to pay the rent? How am I going to get food for my kids? And they go from something that bad has happened to something catastrophic has happened. People who are depressed tend to feel either, we have two of them here, helplessness or lack of control, and self-blame or guilt. And these are two flip sides of the coin. So a lot of people who feel depressed feel like they have no control over what's happening in their lives. Okay? Yeah.
There used to be a song, but part of it was, everybody hates me, nobody loves me, I'm going to eat some worms.
Right.
We had friends that we played that back and forth. I seemed to have turned out okay, but if that becomes serious, that can be really serious.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's one of these things, some of these things you'll recognize, these are thought patterns that are problems. If you're depressed, they're problems. If you're not depressed, maybe they're not a problem for you, but we'll talk about they do put you at some risk. So some people who are depressed feel like they have no control over what happens in their life. They feel helpless, and so they just quit. They have no motivation. Why try? Nothing I do is going to work. Okay, you know, why try in my job if nothing's going to work? I'm still going to get fired. Why try in my relationship? My wife's never going to be happy anyway. Why do these things? Nobody cares about me. Okay, which you kind of mentioned there. That feeling that nobody cares about me, I'm useless, I have no purpose in life. I see that a lot. I do disability evaluations. People who have a physical illness that prevents them from being able to work, particularly if they used to be the provider for the family, get very depressed because their purpose for living is not there anymore, and they focus on that. Let's see. I've got them labeled as inaccurate thoughts. Sometimes they're inaccurate. Sometimes they're accurate. There's a classic study done many years ago in which they had noticed that depressed people feel helpless. They feel like they can't control anything in their lives. And they thought they were exaggerating. So they took a group of depressed people and a group of non-depressed people, and they had them play various games of chance, where they could know. Some of them you have control over whether you win or not. Some of them you have no control. And then they surveyed the people after doing these games to measure their perception of how much control they had. It turned out that the people who were not depressed greatly overestimated their ability to control things in their life, and the people who were depressed were accurate. Okay? So, that's the alternative version is, and a depressed person will tell you this is true, they're just painfully accurate. Okay? But these are still negative thought patterns that are associated with depression. There's a lot of psychological research that says In reality, your best, your most adaptive mindset is slightly over-optimistic, okay? Slightly overestimate your ability to do well, to succeed. Slightly overestimate how much people love you. All of those kinds of things. Not unrealistically, but that keeps you positive. And so those are features of thought patterns. Another big feature of depressive thought patterns is permanence of problems. Okay? Depressed people, when they have a problem, even if it's a real problem, quickly become convinced that it's permanent. It'll never go away. If you're having problems at work, it'll never get better. Yeah.
Would you consider somebody who is consistently pessimistic about almost everything to be depressed?
Not necessarily, but I would say they are at risk for depression. Okay. So we'll go back to, we think of these as separate causes, okay, but these are all interrelated. We think of brain chemistry and negative thought patterns. Every thought you think is an electrical and chemical reaction. Okay, it's a biological activity. So when you change your brain chemistry, when you increase the serotonin levels, it changes the way you think. Okay, but it's also true that when you change the way you think, it changes your brain chemistry. And there have been several studies that have shown that successful treatment with medication or with psychotherapy results in the same changes in brain activity. Okay, so there's two different pathways to change brain activities. So the question is, does your brain chemistry cause your negative thoughts, or do your negative thoughts cause your brain chemistry? And they're connected. There's no way to say. Okay. They have found that, going back to your question, is somebody who's persistently pessimistic, depressed? Not necessarily, but they're at risk for it. People who have these negative thought patterns are at risk, are not always depressed. But if you are a person who is non-depressed and you have the negative thought patterns, you're at higher risk. Okay. Ironically, I haven't been able to see that the same applies for example, serotonin levels. So if they measure your serotonin levels and they're low, that doesn't necessarily mean you're at risk for depression in the future, even though increasing them can increase it. So there's some indication that your thinking patterns are a more important predictor than the biology, than the chemistry of it. Okay.
I like the must and always.
The must, yeah?
I have found that people who, excuse me, I like the must and always. I've found in my work experience that people who have that focus, it must be this way or it must always be this way, have a lot more trouble.
Right. I must always succeed. I always have to be successful. And if I'm not, it's a catastrophe. Okay. Everybody must like me. Okay. Now, we would all agree that it's a good thing to be successful, and you should want to be successful and be motivated to be successful. You should want people to like you. You should be motivated for people to like you. But it's not necessary that everybody must always like you. And that's a depressive thought pattern, is that there's that sense that you always have to be successful in what you do. You must always present with dignity. If you get embarrassed by something, it's a horrible catastrophe. This always happens to me. Okay, I never succeed. I always fail. Is a depressive thought pattern. Whereas I messed up this time, I really did bad, and I failed this time, is not a depressive pattern. Okay, so when we talk about changing thoughts and depressive patterns, it's not just about happy talk and saying everything's good. It's about recognizing, you messed up, you did something bad, you did something stupid, but it's not forever. Okay, it doesn't have to be forever unless you make it forever. Let's see. So we get down to the questions about depression, kind of the causes. we're going to get down to kind of what you can do to change, to relieve your depression. But before we go on to that, any questions about kind of what causes it that you had, that how long it lasts, anything like that? Okay. All right. Yeah.
What about, there's some that are obsessive compulsive, or also people that are more at risk for addiction because of obsessive compulsion. Does that have a role in depression?
Well, the obsessive compulsive, a little bit, it's actually more related to anxiety. And I'll just put in the plug, next Thursday I'm going to be talking about anxiety. But it is more related to anxiety, but there is that sort of that perfectionism that goes along with it. I'm glad you brought up the addiction. Talking about the causes of depression and who gets depressed. We talked about negative life events and genetics and those kinds of things. One thing we didn't mention is gender. Okay. Historically, women have problems with depression at about twice the rate men do. Okay, and that's pretty consistent across the lifespan. Adolescents are at risk for depression, and older people are at risk for depression. A lot of, with the health problems and those kinds of things. So there's that, but men are less likely to get depressed. Men, on the other hand, are about twice as likely as women to have substance abuse problems. Okay, women get sad, men get drunk. Okay, it's kind of what we learned in graduate school. That's our level of what they taught me in graduate school. I always thought it would be interesting to see, take a group of people like Seventh-day Adventists, where most of the men don't get drunk, and see if the rate of depression evened out. I've never seen that studied, but it would be interesting to see. But would they admit it? Well, that's part of the problem. But so I think there's definitely a relationship to addiction, in that people who are depressed are at risk for substance abuse problems. They tend to drink more, they tend to use more other drugs more, and so that is definitely a risk factor. It's both a risk. If you drink too much, if you use drugs, you're at risk for becoming depressed, and if you're depressed, you're at risk for having substance abuse problems. It goes both ways. Okay, so what can you do to relieve depression if you're depressed? I put on the top of the list, sleep. Okay, it's a very critical one. I'm not sure it's kind of inappropriate to put it there, because one of the symptoms of depression is you can't sleep, or you sleep too much. But you can't sleep, so to get rid of depression, just start sleeping. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but it is critical. If you're not getting sleep, it's going to make it much more difficult for anything else to be effective. The key is going to be to, and there's lots of information you can get online, all kinds of things, but keeping a strict schedule, keeping a up activity schedule, down, is critical to being able to start to sleep and recover from depression. And it's hard to do with depression because you have no energy, okay? And you've been up all night, so you don't want to get up in the morning. So it's easy to stay in bed and lay in bed, then you're not really tired in the evening, and so it's a vicious cycle. So putting yourself on kind of a schedule is important. The other thing, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, when you talk about what to do about depression, when you have somebody, yourself or somebody else who's depressed, keep in mind what we talked about, how there are lots of different causes of depression. There's not one cause, okay? And so what's going to work for one person is not going to work for another person. And so when you talk about diet or therapy or medication, what's going to be effective is going to be different for each person. And at this point, unfortunately, in our state of knowledge about mental health, we don't know a lot about who's going to respond to what. Okay, it would be nice if you could look at it and say, well, this person has these symptoms. They sleep a lot, they have an appetite disturbance, they have no energy, it seems to be really physical, so maybe they need medication. Whereas this person cries a lot, so maybe they need something else. It's it's hit or miss. Okay, so you want to take as many of these as you can and apply them to your life and see what works. Physical activity. Okay, there's a lot of research that shows that exercise is critical. It's just on average, it probably does as much good as medication or counseling. Not for everybody. Again, it works for a certain number of people, but if you just look at the proportion it helps or how much it helps, it's a major factor. So if you can get yourself to exercise and be active, and this doesn't necessarily mean running 10 miles every morning, okay, or going to the gym and lifting weights. Being active, getting up, moving around, walking short distances, any kind of physical activity, because when you have depression, you just don't want to do anything. You just don't have the energy. You just don't have the desire, and you tend to get irritated when people suggest otherwise. But that's going to be important for some people. That in itself will be sufficient to get up and exercise. But for most people, it will be at least helpful. Diet. There have actually been a few studies which have found specific foods that seem to be helpful. Okay? Of course, in general, eating a healthy diet is better than not, and it's going to help you. But these specific foods, vitamin D is helpful for reducing depression. And so that's either your milk and other sources or just getting out in the sun. Okay, so omega-3 fatty acids. Fish is a good source of that. Yes.
Years ago, our early Adventist hospitals had solariums at the end of every ward so that they could get sunshine because their patients were sick and they were depressed.
Yeah.
And we don't do that anymore because we have drugs to supplement for that. Right. But solariums, sunshine, is still a good thing.
Yeah. Agreed. And vitamin D seems to be a key to that, but certainly not the only thing. Sunshine, you look at the decline in people's health during the COVID pandemic. There were a lot of things going on. I think one of them was that people stayed indoors a lot more. They didn't go out. They didn't, and so vitamin D levels go down. That affects a lot of things, and it seems to have a specific effect with regard to depression as well. So you want to make sure that you're getting your vitamin D, preferably sunshine, but if you need to take a supplement or whatever you need to do, it is important. Fish, but also if you're a vegetarian, walnuts, soybeans, flaxseed, greens, all have the omega-3 fatty acids, which are helpful. And folic acid. Eggs, citrus, fruit, greens, and peanuts. Okay, so all those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches I ate growing up. True. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. After diet, social activity, social contact is a huge factor. People who are depressed tend to withdraw, and interaction with other people makes a big difference. It doesn't have to be intimate, close interaction, just being around people. Okay, it's good to have the whole range. It's good to have somebody that you can talk to and confide in, but just going and getting together and doing things with people makes a difference. Even just getting out, if you're just walking through the mall, or well, there's not many people there now, but if you're walking through someplace busy, the grocery store, or whatever, being around people seems to have an important effect. And so social activity is important. Antidepressant medication, we'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here. And changing negative thought patterns. I put spiritual activity sort of down at the last, not because it's the least important, but I think because it is, well, one, there is research evidence to show that people who are religiously involved have less depression, have lower rates of depression, pretty significantly. I put it at the bottom because it's kind of a general factor that you can see helps you with a lot of things. Okay, you can see it playing into social activity. Okay, a lot of religious activities or social activity. health messages like the Adventist health message. You'll see it helps with negative thought patterns and those kinds of things. So, let's see. Well, let's talk about antidepressant medication. Okay, this is the most I think I've seen. I think it's still accurate that antidepressants are the most commonly prescribed medication in the U.S. Okay, so what do? Most of them the common ones, Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro. I'm not going to go into a lot of the biochemistry, but what they do is they increase levels of serotonin in your brain, and that can be helpful. Drawbacks to taking let's talk about the pluses and minuses of medication.
Yeah. How does Prozac increase serotonin levels? Is it a synthetic or supplement, or does it activate natural generation of serotonin?
The way and most of they're called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so what they do is they actually don't make you produce any more serotonin. What they do is, so when one neuron transmits a message to the other neuron, they use serotonin. So serotonin leaves one neuron, floats over to the next neuron, and then transmits the message. So and the ones that don't reach the other side get reabsorbed. Well, what Prozac does is it makes you not reabsorb that serotonin that's in the gap. So more of it gets over to the other side. So in effect, you're transmitting more messages, but there's not actually more serotonin in your bloodstream or anything like that, which is part of the reason why it's difficult, several reasons why it's difficult to test, like with blood tests. One is there's a barrier between the blood and the brain, your body's blood and your brain's blood, that it doesn't cross very well. But one is you're not actually increasing the levels. It's not like you're taking artificial serotonin or anything like that. These kind of medications, the plus side, I'll give you the plus side is they're easy and they're cheap compared to therapy. Okay, but they're certainly easy. Okay, and that can be important if you have a disorder in which one of the main symptoms is they have no energy, they have no motivation, they can't concentrate, they can't focus, they don't want to do anything. Okay, then I can tell you, hey, get up and do some physical activity all I want. Okay, but if you have no energy, no motivation, if I'm not your parent who can force you, it's not going to do much. I can say, get out, you need to socialize. If it's severe depression, how are you going to get them out socializing? Okay. Therapy, changing negative thought patterns, is a lot of work. Okay. I'm a psychologist, so I'm obviously predisposed to that, but it is a lot of work. Okay, a lot of mental work, and it's difficult. So the fact that taking a pill is easy is a plus for medication as treatment for depression.
Are there any long-term side effects from taking these medicines?
Okay. There are, yes, let me put it that way. And the side effects vary a lot depending on the person, but there can be all kinds of there can be weight gain, there can be nausea, there can apathy, there can be suicidal ideation. Ironically, medication to treat depression in a small number of people causes intense suicidal ideation, so doctors are more aware of that now, and so they warn patients, if you start having this is critical. When they first started giving the medication, they didn't warn people, and you take a depressed person, all of a sudden they're having these intense suicidal thoughts, and a lot of people died from that. But usually they're warned, and so people can know. If they start having those, they know to talk to their doctor right away. In addition, yes,
is there any risk of dementia or Alzheimer's from taking these drugs?
There is, we should know more, but we're starting to see some long-term effects. There's a risk of heart problems, some indication of issues with dementia. All of these other problems are very complicated with multiple causes. So we don't know all of the long-term causes. When you take an antidepressant medication, typically they'll take 4 to 6 weeks to take effect. So it can be kind of a slow process because the doctor gives you a dosage, then you have to wait at least a month, and then he's going to adjust your dosage. And then you have to wait at least a month, and he's going to adjust your dosage. So it's easy, but it's not quick necessarily. The other thing is people vary a lot in terms of their long-term success with antidepressant medications. I've met people who got on Prozac 25 years ago, did wonders for them. They stayed at the same dose for 25 years, and it's been great. It's also common that you'll get up, you'll have an effect, it works, and it seems to plateau, and then it seems to not work as much anymore. And so you've got to increase the dose, or you've got to change the medication. You know, some people have to end up changing the medication every year or two to a similar medication. Okay, and obviously your body does have to adjust to those medications, and it's not an easy adjustment, so that's a drawback. Your brain's a dynamic organ. So when you do something like increasing serotonin levels, it doesn't just sit there and say, okay, that's good. Your brain is always adjusting levels of various neurotransmitters in your mind. And so for some people, what happens is you increase the serotonin levels, your brain says, oh, my serotonin levels are kind of high. And so it starts producing less. So then, of course, your doctor has to, what? Increase the dosage. Bring it up and adjust. That happens with antidepressant medications, not for everybody, but for some people. It's worse. Pain medications will do the same thing. You have natural endorphins, but when you take opiates, those are increased, so your body thinks, oh, I've got plenty of opiates. I've got plenty of endorphins, so it quits making it. So when you stop taking the pain medication, you have intense pain. Same works for anxiety medications like Xanax or Valium. It gets rid of the anxiety, but your body then stops making that or reduces making that, and you have a rebound effect. So with antidepressant medications, it's not as strong as with pain medications, but for some people, there's a rebound effect. So if you stop taking it, then you may become suddenly much more depressed. You may have other side effects and those kinds of things. So you have to gradually reduce it. So antidepressant medications, there's no doubt that they have helped a lot of people who had severe depression. I mean, I don't. They are also not just drugs that you take on a whim. Sometimes I've seen it. General practitioners, oh, you're feeling down, you're feeling stressed, you're feeling anxious. Let's try you on some Prozac. That seems a little bit too lighthearted for me. I mean, I think these are serious medications. They have a use, but they're not necessarily for every situation in every case, and they do have significant possible side effects. Let's see. Let's talk about the other approach to relieving depression is changing your negative thought patterns. Okay, which usually will mean, although you can do some of yourself, we'll talk a little bit about it, going to a counselor, going to a therapist. And this is my own personal description of two types of therapists that you're going to get. Okay, both of them have usefulness. Most therapists that you go to, I put in the category of a wise friend therapist. These are people who have education about mental health issues. They've seen a lot of people who have mental health issues which may be similar to yours. They're empathetic, they listen, and they give good advice about how to cope with it. Okay, and that's most counselors. They give you practical advice, help you figure out what's going on. They help you understand what's going on. One of the things that people need is to understand what's going on, particularly when it's something like depression where you feel like, well, some people know why they're depressed. I mean, they have obvious reasons to be depressed. Sometimes people feel depressed when their life seems good. And so they need an explanation. And a therapist will usually help you understand, this was from your relationship with your mother or from your husband or whatever their theoretical point of view is, they'll give you an explanation that makes sense. And that can be very helpful for a lot of people who are depressed. A lot of people who are depressed just need someone who they can talk to and who will listen to them and understand them. If you have chronic depression, people who are chronically depressed, not to offend anybody here, but are usually not very pleasant to be around. Okay? They're sad all the time, they're grumpy, they're irritable, nothing's right, no, everything's wrong. So a lot of people will tend to gravitate away from them, okay? Which of course exacerbates the depression because you have less social contact. Now you feel like nobody loves me. There's a grain of truth in that. Okay, it's not nobody, but it's difficult. And so having somebody who will sit and listen to you and help you understand what's going on can be very helpful. And then there's cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy is specifically focused on changing the thoughts that make you depressed or anxious, but we're talking about depression today. So they're going to be very much focused on what are the thoughts that you have now that are making you depressed, okay? The things that we talked about or mentioned here before, exaggerating, okay? Feeling like you have a lack of control, blaming yourself, feeling that problems are permanent. So what they're going to do is they're going to sit down and talk with you and let's see. They're going to get to know a little bit about you, but then they're going to start identifying what are the thoughts that you're thinking now that make you depressed. Okay? And you'll be able to tell a cognitive behavioral therapist because after some initial sort of getting to know you, they're going to start talking about what are the thoughts that make you depressed. Because it's your thoughts that make you depressed, not all those things that are happening to you in your life. Okay? Which is not an intuitive feeling for most people. Most people have the perception that our perception is something bad happens to you and it makes you have an emotion, right? Your boss chews you out at work and you get mad, okay? Or, let's see, my mom's here tonight, so we'll include her. Tonight, after this lecture, we'll get done, suppose we get done and Mom comes up to me and said, well, Todd, that wasn't very interesting and I don't think it really helped anybody. Now, yeah, it's always the mother's fault for psychology, just let you know. So what's my emotion? What emotion am I going to feel? Hurt, sad.
Could be angry.
Or I could be angry, okay?
Discouraged, yeah.
Why do I feel that emotion? First response could be...
Because you have a relationship with your mother.
First response would be because your mom said something mean to you. You have a relationship with your mother. But a cognitive behavioral therapist would say, what was the thought that made that, okay? The thought is, I displeased my mother, and I must always make my mother happy. So that's what the cognitive behavioral therapist is going to want to talk. He's not going to want to talk about was your mom good to you as a kid or not? What was your thought? If your thought was, I must always please my mother, then when she says something to me that I take as critical, that makes me depressed. But it's my thought that makes me depressed, not her thought, okay? And if I can replace that thought with a different thought that, well, I'm sorry Mom didn't enjoy that, but I think I did a pretty good job. Mm-hmm. Or she didn't like it, but everybody else seemed to enjoy it. Everybody else laughed at my jokes. Then that will change my emotion, okay? So they're very much going to go through events in your day, what happened, and what did you feel? Now, what was the thought that came in between, okay? That you can, even if something bad happens, what makes you depressed is the thought that you have about that event. And that's where we get to the exaggerations, okay? So if I'm depressed and my mom, sorry, we can just go back to this one, and my mom says something critical, I'm gonna think, my mom doesn't love me. She doesn't even like me, okay? When really she just thought it was a bad lecture, okay? There's a big difference between mom thought I gave a bad lecture and mom doesn't love me, okay? But the difference is my thought, okay? It also affects what kind of emotions. You suggested I might get mad. Well, maybe so, depending on what I thought, what your thought is. And so one way of reducing symptoms of depression that a cognitive behavioral therapist is going to be able to do is changing your thoughts about events, okay? It's also something that you can do on your own, okay? It helps to have a therapist because they have experience. They know the kinds of thoughts that people often think. But you can also, yeah.
What's the going rate for a therapist now? And is there a less expensive alternative?
Going rate is expensive. I don't even know, but I would think for somebody licensed, it's going to be over $100 an hour, and between $100 and $200 an hour. If you have insurance, it may cover it, may be reasonable, but if you don't, it's going to be very expensive. So that's a drawback. The alternatives are, there are alternatives. One is there are a number of books. If you look up cognitive behavioral self-help, there'll be a bunch of them, okay? But they'll kind of walk you through these things and help you with ideas about how to catch yourself, how to identify the thoughts and change them, If you have that mindset, then you can start to notice the thoughts that you have to change. A lot of sort of the wise counsel or a good friend, put a therapist as a wise friend. Well, sometimes just having a wise friend, a pastor, or just somebody will give you the same kind of, they may not use the same terminology, but they're going to give you the same kind of advice, okay? My mom doesn't love me. Well, now, Todd, think about it. Don't you think you're overreacting a little bit? They're going to give you the same kind of advice. So that's a part of where social interaction comes in. If you can develop a friendship with somebody who you can talk to and talk about things with, who has good judgment, they'll give you some of that information. There's also gender differences here when we talk about talking to people. Women tend to have more broader support networks, can talk to each other and support each other. Men traditionally, maybe it's less today, I don't know. Men traditionally have a support system of one, and that's their spouse, okay? But usually it's going to be that they can talk to about their feelings and their support, if any. Whereas with other men, they tend to do things and do activities, and those are beneficial also. But it can be helpful to have somebody that you can talk to, and that's somebody in roles such as pastor or other family members.
Yeah, the follow-up would be, is this an area of mental/physical health where the church could create a kind of a counseling center or a ministry? Might not want to use the word ministry, but kind of a counseling program where members and non-members could visit with someone who has some training. I know pastors technically have training. Generally speaking, they're not well trained enough in this area, and they don't practice it enough to call themselves experts in this area.
Right.
But they could, it could be helpful beyond the congregation if churches could kind of provide a service here.
Right. I think it's potential depending on who you have and the people there. It's not a complicated idea in terms of something that people can pick up. So you could have it even in groups, those kinds of things. I mean, I think, not necessarily presenting it as treatment for depressed, but it's sort of getting this mindset. I would add, even most counselors don't they have a bit of this in their counseling approach, but they don't take it in a real persistent, where that's that's one piece that they have. So there's potential there. I think, like I said, there's a lot of self-help stuff you can buy about cognitive behavioral therapy and that kind of stuff. So potential.
Have you had occasion to work with any veterans with PTSD? And doing cognitive behavioral therapy to change that traumatic event into something less traumatic?
Yeah. Well, and PTSD is an anxiety-related disorder. And so, yeah, cognitive behavioral, but you have to add a piece that addresses the physiological arousal that's with anxiety. So, again, plug for next Thursday night. But we'll talk about that some. But the way to do this on your own is to identify the thoughts. What are the things, when something makes you upset, angry, sad, whatever, you have an emotional reaction, but stop and think, why is it that this is so upsetting to me? What am I thinking that's made me upset? Our natural reaction is, whatever happened made me upset. You made me mad, you made me angry. This is adding a step. Something happened, what did I think that made me angry? What did I think? And begin to identify those, and then start catching yourself. Every time you think one of those things, notice it and say, oh, there I did it again. There I did it again. There I did it again. People who are depressed do it a lot, okay, through the day. It helps to have like a workbook or something like that, or a note. You take notes and you record them. And then the next thing you want to do is replace it. Whenever you think it, whenever you catch yourself, then you replace it, okay? If it's nobody loves me, I'm useless, then every time you catch yourself saying nobody loves me, then you say, no, my mother loves me, even though she's critical of me. No, no, you say, and again, it doesn't have to be happy thoughts, but my mother loves me, okay? My friend loves me, my spouse loves me, even though they're difficult to get along with. So there are, you have to think of things to replace it with that you can do. Yeah, Cal.
This is one of the great things about God, and the fact that you can take the thoughts that you're having and have Him to ask Him to take them away, change them, so on and so forth. And He comes along and does that. You may have that reoccurring thought a few minutes later, but you can still come back to Him and continue to ask for Him until you gain a victory over whatever negative thought you have.
Right. So from a spiritual point of view, as Cal was saying, that's what God can do is take these thoughts away from you. And as you said, usually it's not take these thoughts away from me and then they never come back, right? Even though we might ask for that, they come back over and over and over again. And that's also what happens when you're doing it from a cognitive behavioral perspective is this takes persistence. Again, that's a problem with depression because it's hard to be persistent, but you have to do it over and over again. The first time you tell yourself, no, people really do love me, you don't believe it, okay? But when you replace the repeated thought, nobody loves me, with people do love me, somebody loves me, over and over again, it starts to change the way you feel, okay? This is also where, when you start to look at those negative thoughts, patterns, this is a lot where spirituality comes in, okay? In my life, I may look around and feel like nobody loves me, okay? If I'm a Christian, who do I know who loves me? Okay. I may feel useless. I can't provide for my family because I'm disabled. I can't, I'm so grumpy, I can't give them any social pleasure. But what is my use? Does God have a purpose for me? Yeah. God has a purpose for you. He has a way to work with you. Things will never get better. From a Christian point of view, we know God can make things better in our life now, and we know that there's the promise of the afterlife, even if it seems hopeless here on earth. Okay, so there are a lot of aspects of Christianity which and belief in God and following God, which address exactly the kind of thoughts that we're having. Okay, for people who have no belief in God, truly, your life can be meaningless. You can be at a point in your life where there's no point. I did a disability evaluation of a woman who, in the last 5 years, both of her children had died, one from a drug overdose. Her husband had just died. She had no income. She just lost her house, and she'd just been diagnosed with cancer. So, was she depressed because of irrational thoughts? No. She was depressed because of rational thoughts. And interviewing her, I was like, oh, it was crushing. What would be the only thing that could keep her from being depressed? Would be knowing that there's more to it than just this life, and spiritual beliefs. So now, would she still be sad and in a bad position? Absolutely. But that would be the only thing that could put you in that situation that could make you feel like life was worth living. Okay. So the spirituality part of it encourages hope and the knowledge that things can change. It encourages you to gather together and to meet and connect with people. God acts in two ways, two levels usually, I think. He can act on us supernaturally. He can take that thought from us. He can he can change our emotions if he chooses to. But he also gives us instructions about how to live and how to think that will also make us happier as well. So, yeah, Cal.
That's okay. Had a experience one time I enjoyed, and it just points out to the fact is that having a rough day, things weren't going my way, and I had somebody to speak to me very kindly, and that changed my whole day. Mm-hmm. And when we're dealing with people, we always have to remember. Right. Sometimes it don't work so well between me and my wife. I have to say that. But how we treat people can definitely determine how they feel as far as depression, stuff like that.
Right. It does, and I think that also gives a sense of purpose. If all the things that you're used to living your life for, we go through life and we're a child, we're a parent, we're a spouse, we're a provider. We do all these things, and you get in a position where for a physical disability or for whatever reason you can't do that anymore, there's a sense of a lack of purpose. Well, Christianity and belief in God provides you a purpose. If there's nothing you can do but give somebody a smile and make their day, encourage them, that's worthwhile. But you have to find those things. The more depressed you are and the more severely depressed, the harder you have to look for those things to find. Spirituality also gives you, the last one here I'll mention, forgiveness. Okay, a lot of people get on in their life, and we talked about inappropriate or incorrect, inaccurate thoughts, and they feel guilt. Well, some of us feel guilt because we really did bad things, or we're really doing bad things. And one thing that spirituality and a relationship with God offers is the potential for forgiveness. Okay, that there is forgiveness for no matter what I've done. So, getting towards the end here, there are things you can do. We've gone over to kind of relieve depression, but there's a big difference between what you should do to relieve your own depression and what you should do to try to help somebody else relieve their depression. Okay, those are two different things, and take two different approaches. If you're depressed and you want to help yourself, you need to be a taskmaster. Okay, you need to be tough. You got to be persistent. You have to be forceful and make yourself do the things you should do. Make a list. I've got to be active. I've got to go socialize. I've got to do these things whether I feel like it or not. Whether you feel like it has nothing to do with it. Okay, these are the things that I know that are likely to help. Therefore, I have to do them, and you've got to be a taskmaster. Now, when you fail, and you don't do those things, you have to forgive yourself. Okay? That your failure is not, well, I tried to do it, I did it all this week and I didn't do anything. I didn't go out, I let myself down, so I failed. No, that means I've let myself down, I've messed up, I'm going to do better next week, and you've got to be a taskmaster for yourself. Okay? But that approach does not work if you're trying to help somebody else with depression. Okay? If you have a friend who's depressed and you're pushing them, and you've got to go out, you've got to go walking, you've got to go to church because we're socializing, you've got to go to potluck, you've got to do this. It doesn't work. Okay? You really have to take a different approach because you can motivate yourself, you can force yourself, you can't force somebody else. So you're much more going to have to take the approach of the wise friend. Okay? Be willing to listen. Okay? And empathize with them. Okay? So even though you can see that they're maybe overreacting, they're exaggerating. You don't start off with, I went to this seminar, and what you're doing is you're catastrophizing, and it's really not as bad as you said. Okay, try that with your spouse, see how it works out. That's not what you want to do. Okay, being able to help people always comes from being in a relationship with them. Okay, so you listen to them, you empathize, learn what they're interested in. Remember, a big part of depression is they don't want to do anything. Okay? Now, you can encourage them, let's go do this activity, or you can do that activity, but you're better off if you know what they like, or what they used to like. Okay? And do that. Encourage them to do that. So you have to know a little bit about them. Encourage them to be more active. Okay? Physical activity, social activity are critical, and that's what you can provide. Don't force them, don't coerce them, but just be persistent, okay? A lot of people try to help someone who's depressed. And then the person doesn't want to go out, they don't want to talk to you, they're a little bit grumpy, or they're a lot grumpy. And after a while, then, they quit trying to help. It's hard to try to help somebody who doesn't seem to want your help, doesn't seem to be responding to your help. So you got to be persistent, maintain contact, even if it's a little bit of contact, a phone contact, a call, a drop by, encourage, and persistence over time is important. Okay. Modeling positive thinking. Okay, so that sort of reframing. If they say something bad, you can even jokingly with them. Okay, well, my boss is mad at me and he's going to fire me, and won't have a job, won't be able to pay the rent. Say, well, at least you'll have a little vacation. Okay, you can only do this after you know them. Okay, and they understand that you're joking, that you're kidding. But there's a lot of power in humor, being able to take difficult situations and recognize that there are things that can happen that's not as bad as you think. Colin Powell's rules?
Colin Powell's rules. That some of them fit this. Like his first rule is, don't despair, things will look better in the morning.
Right.
That's rule number one.
Yeah, it's not permanent.
Right.
Yeah.
Rule number two, don't be so identified with your job that if your job fails, you no longer have an identity.
Right.
That's one of his rules. So I think about that
Yeah.
in terms of...
And that's sort of the common sense sort of cognitive behavioral approach.
Right.
That it's your
Right.
thoughts. It's
Right. And even in the activity, get up, make your bed.
Yeah, get up, keep moving. Depression makes you want to not do anything. And so pretty much anything that you can get yourself to do, or you can get the person who's depressed to do, is going to be beneficial.
Get up, make your bed, then you accomplish.
One of the drawbacks of thinking of depression as a chemical imbalance, as a medical disorder, is that it leads us to be a little bit helpless with it. If we think the cure is, if you have COVID, we don't say, well, get out and do some social activity and do physical activity and all that. you know, you go and you get your medicine and you rest and you get better. Depression's not like that, okay? Although there's a biological aspect to it, you can alter your brain chemistry by the things that you do, by the activities you do, the thoughts that you do. And so you don't just wait around for something to cure you. You have to make yourself move and make yourself do things. That's kind of where I'm at with the kind of structured part. So if there's questions, or if we want to close and then there's questions, or however you want to do it.
Are there any questions or comments for Dr. Morton? Let's close with prayer.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I think he gave a really good talk.
I'm so happy, see?
His mother said he gave a really good talk, and we agree. Thank you all for coming. Let's close with prayer. Father, we thank you so much for your watch care over us, and we thank you for this delicate yet very important discussion. Please bless all as they go about their activities this day and this evening. Amen. Thank you
You're welcome.
very much. And don't forget, next Thursday, anxiety.
Also Tuesday,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tuesday-
Tuesday is physical activity and mental health,
right?
How physical activity affects your brain.
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
And then anxiety on Thursday. Right.